Walter Reeves had built empires, closed billion-dollar deals, and never looked back, until the day he saw a homeless woman clutching two little girls on a snowy street corner. He stopped for a moment. That moment changed everything. Snowflakes swirled through the air like tiny shards of glass as the black SUV rolled down Fifth Avenue. The windows were tinted, shielding Walter Reeves from the cold world outside. Inside, the silence was thick, no music, no phone calls, just the hum of the engine and the faint clicking of the turn signal as the driver slowed for a red light. Walter leaned his head against the window, his breath fogging the glass. He had just left another boardroom, another endless meeting about growth, margins, and international expansion. A day like any other in his high-powered, high-priced life. But then something caught his eye. At the intersection, just beyond the crosswalk, stood a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 30. Her coat was far too thin for the biting January air, and her scarf looked like it had been knitted years ago and worn every day since. She stood rigidly, holding two little girls close to her sides. The children were shivering. One of them had no gloves. The other was rubbing her hands together and blowing into them, her nose bright red from the cold. Both wore identical pink hats, the only new-looking thing on them. Walter felt a knot form in his chest. He didn't know why, but he reached forward and tapped the driver's shoulder. "Stop the car." The driver glanced in the rearview mirror. "Sir?" "Just stop," Walter repeated, more firmly. The SUV pulled to the curb, and before the driver could open the door for him, Walter had already stepped out into the snow. The cold hit him like a slap, but he ignored it. He walked toward the woman slowly, cautiously, unsure what he was doing. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe curiosity. Maybe something else entirely. She noticed him coming and instinctively pulled the girls closer, her body tensing as though she expected him to shout, or worse, call someone to remove them. "I'm not here to bother you," Walter said, lifting his hands in a peaceful gesture. Are you all right?" The woman hesitated. Her eyes were wary, tired, but not defeated. "We're fine, thank you," she replied quietly. Her voice was hoarse, like someone who hadn't spoken much in days. The two girls looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. They didn't speak. One clung to her mother's leg, the other stood with her hand in her mouth, watching him like he was a strange animal. Walter glanced around. The street was busy but not bustling. No one else seemed to notice them. How could they not see what he was seeing? "You don't look fine," he said softly. "The girls are freezing." She bristled slightly. "We're used to it." "No one should be used to this," he said, shaking his head. He looked at the girls again. Something about them tugged at him, deeper than just compassion. A flash of recognition that didn't make sense. Their eyes, maybe. Their posture. A strange ache bloomed in his chest, and for a second, he felt short of breath. "Look," he said, his voice a little unsteady, "I'm not trying to offend you. But there's a cafe right across the street. Let me take you and the kids in. Get something warm to eat. No strings." She didn't answer right away. Her jaw was tight. Pride and fear wrestled in her expression. Then one of the girls let out a small cough, and the sound seemed to break her. "Just to eat," she said. Walter nodded. Just to eat. As they began to cross the street together, the snow falling heavier now, Walter had no idea that this moment, this random, quiet act, was about to rewrite everything he thought he knew about his life. The warmth of the cafe hit them like a wave as they stepped through the door. The windows were fogged from the heat inside meeting the bitter cold of the street, and the smell of fresh coffee and baked bread wrapped around them like a blanket. Walter held the door open for the woman and her two daughters, watching them walk in with small, uncertain steps. The younger girl stumbled a little on the mat, and her sister instinctively reached out to steady her. They were quiet, too quiet for children their age. No giggles, no questions, no complaints, just wide eyes scanning the unfamiliar brightness and heat. A server greeted them at the entrance with a polite smile, clearly curious but professional enough not to ask questions. Walter raised a hand and said simply, "Table for 4, somewhere warm." The server led them to a booth in the corner, next to a small radiator that hummed softly. Walter slid in on one side, the woman and girls sat across from him. The girls pressed close to their mother, still unsure whether they were allowed to relax. He took off his coat and laid it over the back of the seat, then gestured for the server to bring menus. While they waited, he looked across at the woman, noticing for the first time how thin she was beneath her coat. Not just slim, but worn down. Her face held traces of a beauty that hadn't vanished but had been buried under exhaustion and hardship. Her eyes were sharp, cautious, protective, like someone who had learned long ago that kindness often came with a catch. "What's your name?" Walter asked gently. She hesitated. "Sarah." He nodded slowly, repeating the name silently in his head. "And the girls?" "Lily and Sky," she replied, her voice quiet but clearer now. She looked at them for a moment, softening, before adding, "They're 6. "Beautiful names," he said. He looked at the twins again, still huddled close, their cheeks flushed now not just from the cold but from the rising warmth of the cafe. "Would it be all right if they ordered anything they want?" Sarah hesitated again. Her pride was tangled up with gratitude, and it was clear that accepting help wasn't something that came easily to her. But when she saw Lily glancing at the chalkboard menu with a kind of silent longing, she gave a tiny nod. Walter smiled and flagged down the server. "2 hot chocolates," he said. "With extra marshmallows. And whatever they want to eat. Sandwiches, soup, anything." He glanced at Sarah. "And for you too." The girls perked up at the mention of hot chocolate, and for the first time, a spark of light flickered across their faces. They still didn't speak, but Lily tugged gently on her mother's sleeve and pointed at a picture of grilled cheese in the menu. Sky followed, choosing tomato soup. Sarah gave a quiet "thank you" to Walter, and for a moment, the air between them settled. No longer strangers, not quite friends, just 2 people brought together by something they didn't fully understand yet. The food came quickly, steaming and fragrant. The girls dug in without hesitation. It was clear they hadn't had a hot meal in days. Walter tried not to stare, but he couldn't look away. The way they held their spoons with small, delicate fingers, the way they looked at each other to make sure they had the same amount, it was heartbreaking and beautiful all at once. "You said you're used to the cold," he said to Sarah. "How long have you been out there?" She didn't answer right away. She took a sip of coffee the server had brought her and stared out the window, as if weighing how much to reveal. "A few weeks," she said eventually. "We were staying in a shelter, but it closed for repairs. We've been trying to find another one ever since." Walter felt a deep discomfort settle in his chest. He was a man who dealt in billions, who made phone calls that shifted stock markets, who owned entire skyscrapers. And yet, just steps from one of his buildings, a woman and 2 children were freezing. "No family?" he asked quietly. "Not anymore," she replied, her voice tight. "My parents passed a few years ago." "No siblings?" "No one else." Walter nodded slowly. He didn't press further, though every instinct told him there was more to the story. A lot more. The girls were nearly finished eating now. Sky gave a sleepy yawn, and Lily leaned against her mother's side, eyes blinking heavily. Sarah wrapped her arms around them both, and for the first time since they'd entered, she looked less like a stranger and more like something familiar. Walter felt a strange pull in his gut. He couldn't place it exactly, just a growing sense that something about this woman and her daughters mattered. More than it should for a passing moment of charity. More than logic could explain. There was a connection forming in the quiet. In their faces. In something unspoken. He looked at the girls one more time. Their expressions, the shape of their eyes, the way they smiled even through fatigue, it all started to feel eerily familiar. He tried to shake it off, but the thought lingered at the back of his mind like a whisper he couldn't hear clearly. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The cafe had begun to quiet down. The lunch rush was over, and only a few tables remained occupied, businessmen on laptops, an elderly couple sharing a slice of pie, a young woman reading near the window. But at the corner booth, time seemed to move differently. The twins had finished eating and now sat curled up beside their mother, their bellies full and their eyes heavy with the kind of sleepiness that only warmth and safety could bring. Lily had her head on Sarah's lap, thumb gently resting against her lower lip, while Skye absent-mindedly traced the edge of her cup with a tiny finger. Walter found himself watching them in silence. Not staring, not out of politeness, but because something about them unsettled him in a way he didn't fully understand. It wasn't just pity or concern, he had seen hardship before, had written checks to shelters, hospitals, and youth centers. But this was different. This wasn't distant. This wasn't something he could walk away from without it following him. It was their faces. He looked at Lily and Skye, really looked. There was something behind their features, a subtle mirror of himself. The shape of their noses. The way their eyebrows arched ever so slightly when they were focused. Even the way they glanced at each other before making a decision, just as he had done with his younger brother growing up, before he lost him. His heart began to pound, and he leaned back in the booth, trying to brush away the thought. It was ridiculous. Coincidence, nothing more. There were millions of little girls in the world. He was just imagining things, layering emotion over reality. But as he stole another glance at them, the denial started to crack. He turned to Sarah, who had noticed the shift in his expression. She tilted her head slightly, cautious but curious. "Can I ask something personal?" Walter said, his voice lower now. Sarah nodded slowly, wary. "When did you say they were born?" "April 6th, she replied without hesitation, as any mother would. 6 years ago. The room tilted slightly in Walter's mind. He didn't react immediately, he couldn't. He did the math quickly, almost automatically. 6 years. That would be 2019. Spring. It lined up almost exactly with the last time he had seen Sarah Hunt, the woman he'd loved with a kind of reckless intensity, then lost just as quickly. They had spent 6 months together in Boston, wrapped in work, late-night talks, and a chemistry he hadn't been able to replicate since. They had fought one night, badly. He had a flight to Zurich for a deal he couldn't postpone. She said she couldn't follow. He left, expecting to fix things later. But when he came back, she was gone. No note. No call. No trace. He tried to find her, but her number was disconnected. Her apartment was empty. Friends said she had moved out of the city. Eventually, he convinced himself she hadn't wanted to be found. He looked at Sarah now, the way her fingers gently stroked Lily's hair, the curve of her jaw, the quiet strength in her posture. Her features weren't identical to the Sarah he remembered, but life had changed her. The years had added lines of stress and streaks of silver in her hair. But the eyes, those eyes were the same. "You lived in Boston, didn't you?" he asked slowly, afraid of the answer. Her body stiffened. She looked directly at him for the first time since they sat down, and there was something sharp in her gaze, something that knew exactly what he was asking. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "A long time ago." Walter's breath caught in his throat. He suddenly couldn't feel his hands. The edges of the table, the sounds of the cafe, the warmth of the radiator, all of it blurred into the background. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His throat was dry. "Sarah Hunt," he said finally, almost in disbelief. She froze. You're Sarah Hunt." The way she looked at him in that moment, eyes wide, jaw clenched, breath held, confirmed everything before she even spoke. "I was," she said, her voice low. "I still am. But I wasn't sure you'd remember." Walter stared at her, the truth crashing over him in waves. The girls. The dates. The vanishing act. It wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. She hadn't disappeared by choice. And those little girls sleeping beside her weren't just strangers he'd felt some strange connection to. They were his daughters. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. He could only sit there, stunned, as the weight of 6 lost years settled onto his shoulders like snowfall, soft but suffocating. Walter sat completely still, the leather of the booth pressing into his back as if trying to keep him grounded. The world outside the cafe continued its steady rhythm, cars passed, people walked by bundled in coats and scarves, but inside, time had stopped. The hum of conversation around them faded to a distant murmur as his mind tried to wrap itself around what Sarah had just confirmed. These girls, Lily and Sky, his daughters. For 6 years, he had lived unaware that a part of him existed out there, shivering on a New York sidewalk, searching for shelter. He looked at them again, now asleep beside their mother, small faces calm in a way that only comes after a long period of tension. They had eaten, they were warm, and for now, they felt safe. But behind that peace was a reality that shook him. They had suffered. They had been cold, hungry, scared. And he hadn't known. He hadn't been there. Walter turned back to Sarah, struggling to find the right words. Questions raced through his head like a storm, all tangled together: why she left, why she hadn't told him, why she disappeared. But when he met her eyes again, he didn't see the answers. He saw pain. The kind of pain that doesn't vanish with time, only burrows deeper. "You have to tell me," he said finally, his voice low but urgent. "Why didn't you call me? Why didn't you tell me they existed?" Sarah sat upright, her hands resting protectively over the girls. Her jaw was tight, her eyes steady but filled with something raw. "I tried," she said. "God, Walter, I tried." He blinked, confused. "You think I just vanished without a reason?" she continued, her voice shaking now, though she fought to keep it steady. "When you left for Zurich, I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks later. I was terrified, but I was ready to tell you. I called. I texted. I left messages. But then someone answered your phone, your assistant, the one with the accent. Mark." Walter's face darkened. "What did he say?" Sarah took a deep breath, as if forcing herself to relive it. "He said you'd moved on. That you didn't want anything to do with me. That you were seeing someone else, and that I should respect your wishes and not try to contact you again." Walter felt a coldness wash over him, far deeper than the weather outside. Mark had been with him for years. Trusted. Loyal. Or so he thought. "I didn't believe him at first," she continued. "But then I stopped getting responses. My emails bounced back. Your number changed. I even wrote a letter, but it came back undelivered. I thought you hated me." "I never knew," Walter whispered, more to himself than to her. "I never heard any of that. I swear to you, Sarah, I never got a message, a call, anything. If I had known." He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't know what to say. No apology could reclaim the years he had missed. "I didn't have anyone else," Sarah said, her voice quieter now. "My mom died a month before the girls were born. My dad was already gone. I couldn't afford a lawyer. I worked 2 jobs until I started showing. Then one by one, they let me go. It's hard to find work when you're pregnant with twins and no health insurance." Walter's stomach turned. "I sold everything I had," she went on. "I moved from one tiny room to another. After they were born, I worked nights cleaning offices. I did what I had to do. And I never told them who you were. I didn't want them growing up thinking their father didn't want them. There was no accusation in her voice, only exhaustion. She wasn't trying to make him feel guilty, she was just telling the truth. Walter looked down at his hands. They had built empires. Signed million-dollar contracts. Held champagne flutes at galas. But they had never held his daughters. Not once. I should have found you, he murmured. I should have looked harder. You tried for a while, didn't you? She asked, almost gently. He nodded. When I came back from Zurich and you were gone. I didn't understand. You left no trace. I thought you'd made your choice. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their separate tragedies sinking between them. It was strange, neither of them had wanted to be apart, yet the world had conspired to make it happen anyway. Sarah glanced down at the girls. They're good kids, she said softly. Smart. Kind. They deserve more than what I've been able to give them. Walter looked at her and saw not a stranger but the woman he had once loved, the woman he still might love, though he was afraid to admit it. Her strength, her stubbornness, her unwavering loyalty to her children, it hadn't changed. What had changed was everything else. You're not alone anymore, he said quietly. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. For the first time, she didn't try to argue or dismiss his words. She just looked at him, tired but hopeful. And in that moment, something shifted. Not everything was forgiven. Not everything was healed. But the wall between them had started to crack. And through that crack, something new was beginning to grow. The sky outside had darkened. Through the foggy cafe windows, the city lights began to flicker on, one by one, casting a soft amber glow over the snow-covered streets. Inside, the warmth remained steady, but at the booth in the corner, the emotional temperature shifted into deeper waters. The storm of discovery had passed, but in its wake was something heavier, grief. Not the kind that explodes outward, but the kind that sinks in, quiet and weighty, filling every breath with unspoken thoughts. Walter sat back, his hands clasped in front of him on the table, his eyes focused on nothing in particular. His thoughts were no longer racing, they were drifting now, through 6 lost years he couldn't reclaim. The image of those 2 little girls curled up in a booth, fast asleep without knowing who the man across from them really was, played over and over in his mind. He kept seeing their faces, their tiny hands, their matching hats, and the unshakable truth that they were his. Across from him, Sarah was quiet. The emotion in her face had softened, but it hadn't disappeared. She was holding herself upright with effort, the way someone does when they've been forced to stand alone for far too long. Her fingers brushed gently through Lily's hair, and though her gaze was on the girls, Walter could feel that her attention was split, part of her still in the moment, and part of her lost in everything she'd just confessed. "Why didn't you ask for help?" he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't have anyone to ask," she replied without looking up. "You had me," he said quickly, then paused. "Or at least, you were supposed to." Sarah looked at him now, really looked, and Walter saw the sharpness in her eyes again, not anger, but the sting of a memory that had never healed. "I didn't know that," she said. "I thought you wanted me gone." He exhaled, guilt tightening around his chest. "Mark made that decision for me. I didn't even know he'd spoken to you." "He sounded so sure," she said. "Like he'd done this before." Walter's stomach churned. It wasn't just betrayal, it was sabotage. Mark had always been controlling, always a gatekeeper. But Walter had trusted him blindly. Now, that trust had a cost far greater than any business deal. "I fired him 6 months after you were gone," he murmured. "He started getting too involved in my personal life. I didn't know. I didn't even think to connect it." Sarah nodded slightly, not in forgiveness but in understanding. "It doesn't matter anymore," she said. "What's done is done." But that wasn't true, and they both knew it. The past mattered. It mattered to the two little girls who had never known their father. It mattered to the man who had lost 6 years with them. It mattered to the woman who had raised them alone, thinking she'd been abandoned. The damage was real, and the scars ran deep. Walter leaned forward. "It does matter. Maybe I can't fix what happened, but I can be here now. If you'll let me." Sarah's eyes flickered, caught somewhere between hope and self-protection. "You don't owe us anything, Walter." He shook his head. "It's not about what I owe. It's about what I've missed. What I want. I want to know them. I want them to know me." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "They don't even know you exist." "Then let me tell them," he said. "Let me be the one to explain." She hesitated, then looked down at the girls. "It's not that simple. I've spent their whole lives protecting them from disappointment. They've asked about their dad, but I never had an answer I could give them without breaking their hearts. I didn't want to lie, but I also didn't want them to feel unwanted." Walter closed his eyes for a moment, trying to imagine what it must have been like, fielding those questions, holding in her pain while comforting them. The thought of them wondering why their father didn't love them, when the truth was he didn't even know they existed, was almost too much to bear. "I can't erase the hurt," he said quietly. "But I can start being present. I can show up. I can prove I want to be part of their lives." Sarah didn't answer right away. She looked out the window instead, watching snow collect on the sidewalk. Finally, she said, "They're sensitive. Smarter than they let on. If you promise something and break it, it'll do more damage than you realize." "I understand," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She turned back to him, studying his face as if seeing it for the first time all over again. The sharp lines of his jaw, the streaks of gray in his hair, the weariness in his eyes, he looked different than he had 6 years ago, but the man underneath was still there. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't see a stranger. She saw someone trying. "I want to believe you," she said. "Then let me earn it," he replied. It wasn't a grand declaration. There were no sweeping promises or emotional outbursts. Just two people, in the quiet after the storm, trying to pick up the pieces of what could have been, what still might be. For the first time since sitting down at that booth, Walter felt a fragile sense of possibility, like a door had opened just enough for light to get through. And for Sarah, the weight she carried alone for so long felt just a little bit lighter. The following morning brought a kind of quiet Sarah hadn't experienced in years. Not the anxious silence of cold mornings on street corners or the muffled stillness of a shelter hallway before dawn. This was a different kind of quiet, warm, calm, and for once, not filled with dread about what the day would bring. She opened her eyes slowly and sat up, blinking in the soft hotel room light as the thick curtains blocked out most of the city. The twins were still asleep beside her, curled into each other like always, but for the first time in recent memory, they weren't shivering. The previous night had passed in a blur. Walter had insisted on finding them a place to sleep that wasn't a bench or a crowded cot in a noisy shelter. At first, Sarah had refused, reflexively, instinctively, but the girls were exhausted and the offer too sincere to ignore. Walter hadn't chosen a grand suite or anything extravagant. He'd picked a modest, clean hotel just a few blocks away, paid for the room in cash, and left without making a scene. He told her he'd be back in the morning with breakfast and hadn't pushed for anything else. It was the first time in years that a man had offered help without expectation. As the girls slowly stirred awake, blinking and rubbing their eyes, Sarah smiled for the first time in days. Lily sat up and looked around, confusion in her face melting into wonder as she realized they were still in the warm room. Skye, half covered by the blanket, mumbled something about pancakes, and Sarah laughed quietly. They didn't have to wait long. At exactly 8 a.m., a soft knock came at the door. Sarah moved carefully, still wary despite everything, and opened it to find Walter standing there with a paper tray of breakfast, eggs, toast, fruit, and 2 small boxes of chocolate milk. He looked hesitant, as if unsure whether he'd be welcomed. "Good morning," he said softly. "Hope I'm not too early." Sarah stepped aside and let him in. "You're right on time." The girls lit up when they saw him, though they still didn't quite know who he was. To them, he was the nice man who bought them food and made Mom smile, something they hadn't seen in a while. Walter sat on the edge of the armchair as the girls dug into their breakfast at the small table by the window. He didn't try to control the moment or steer it. He just watched, listened, and waited. After they ate, he offered to take them to get clothes. Sarah started to say no, old habits whispering warnings, but Walter interrupted gently. "I know it's a lot. I know you don't want to feel like you're accepting charity. But they need boots. Real coats. Gloves. Let me do this, Sarah. Not because I'm trying to buy my way in, but because they're mine too." She hesitated, then nodded. Not because she was ready to fully trust, but because she knew he was right. The day passed in small, ordinary moments that somehow felt extraordinary. A trip to a department store where the girls tried on winter jackets and giggled when the sleeves were too long. Sky choosing a pair of sparkly sneakers and refusing to take them off even at the checkout counter. Lily wrapping herself in a soft pink scarf and twirling like she'd seen on TV. Sarah stood by their side, overwhelmed, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Walter never hovered, never made her feel like a guest in his world. He just existed beside them, steady and attentive. Later, he suggested they stop by a small pediatric clinic he trusted. The girls hadn't seen a doctor in over a year. Sarah tensed at the idea, worried about the cost, but Walter had already arranged everything quietly. The nurses were kind, the appointments smooth. The girls were healthy, though underweight. Sarah sat in the corner of the exam room, watching Walter hold Lily's hand while she got her flu shot, and something inside her shifted. He wasn't performing. He wasn't checking a box. He was simply being there in a way that couldn't be faked. By the time evening came, Sarah felt like she'd lived 3 days in one. When they returned to the hotel, the girls were half asleep again, heads on each other's shoulders in the back seat of the car Walter had rented for the day. Sarah carried them upstairs one at a time with his help, tucked them in, and stood by the window while Walter lingered by the door. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted, arms crossed lightly over her chest. "I don't know how to navigate any of this." "You don't have to," Walter said. "Not alone. We'll figure it out. One day at a time." Sarah turned to face him. There was still doubt in her, still a protective wall that wouldn't come down easily. But behind that wall, a part of her wanted to believe him. Not just for herself, but for the girls. "Tomorrow," she said finally. "You can come back tomorrow." Walter smiled. "I'll be here." As he left and she closed the door, Sarah leaned her forehead against it for a moment, exhaling slowly. The weight of the past still clung to her shoulders, but for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel so terrifying. Not because everything was solved, but because someone else had finally chosen to carry part of the load. In the weeks that followed, a fragile but steady rhythm began to take shape. It wasn't perfect, and there were moments when Sarah felt like the ground beneath her might shift again, but something real was building, something she hadn't let herself hope for in a very long time. Walter showed up every day, always early, always patient. Sometimes he brought breakfast, sometimes books for the girls, sometimes nothing at all but his full attention. And it was that, more than anything, that began to soften the years of hard edges Sarah had developed to protect herself. The twins adjusted faster than she expected. Lily was curious, full of questions, and always watching Walter with wide, observant eyes. Skye was more cautious, clinging a bit more tightly to Sarah at first, but even she began to open up, especially after Walter let her help drive the shopping cart at the grocery store one afternoon and told her she was the best navigator he'd ever had. They didn't know yet that he was their father. Sarah had asked him to wait, to let them get used to him before dropping something so life-altering. He agreed without hesitation. He didn't push. He just showed up, day after day, proving himself in quiet ways. One morning, as snow dusted the sidewalks and the city moved in its usual hectic pace, Sarah stood outside a small design firm just off Lexington Avenue. Her fingers gripped the handle of her old leather portfolio, one she hadn't used in years. Inside were drawings she'd created in the dim light of borrowed rooms and shelter basements, work she never thought anyone would see. But Walter had seen them. He'd found her sketchpad one night while the girls were asleep and sat in stunned silence as he flipped through the pages. "You're incredible," he had said, and she could tell by the way his voice caught that he meant it. Now, standing in front of the firm, she felt more nervous than she had in years. It had been so long since she thought of herself as anything more than a mother in survival mode. But she walked through the door, portfolio clutched to her chest, and introduced herself to the woman at the front desk. The interview lasted over an hour. The firm's lead architect, a kind man in his 50s, reviewed her work carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and at the end, offered her a part-time position on the spot. Sarah left the building stunned, stepping into the cold sunlight with her heart thudding in her chest, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar feeling of hope. Walter met her outside with 2 coffees in hand, unaware of what had just happened. The second he saw her expression, he broke into a grin. "You got it, didn't you?" he asked. She nodded, barely able to contain her smile. "I start Monday." He handed her a coffee and pulled her into a quick, tight hug. She didn't pull away. They spent the rest of the afternoon at a nearby park. The girls ran through the snow in their new boots, making lopsided snow angels and laughing so hard that passers-by turned to smile. Sarah and Walter watched from a bench, a quiet understanding growing between them. "They're amazing," he said, eyes never leaving the girls. "They're strong," Sarah replied. "Stronger than they should have to be." "You made them that way," he said gently. "You kept them safe." She didn't answer, but his words stayed with her. The next few days moved quickly. Sarah started work, and for the first time in years, she felt like herself again, not just a mother, not just a survivor, but an artist, a contributor. She came home tired, but it was a good kind of tired. Walter had arranged for a short-term apartment nearby, close enough to help with the girls but separate enough to respect her space. He took them to school, made their lunches, even helped with math homework, which Skye declared was way more fun with him around. The girls began calling him Mr. W, though it was Lily who one day, sitting at the breakfast table, looked at Sarah and asked, "Is he gonna be around forever?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She looked at Walter, who paused mid-sip of his coffee, watching her carefully. "I think so," Sarah said finally. Walter smiled, but there was something behind it, something deeper. Later that night, as the girls fell asleep, he asked her quietly, "When do we tell them?" Sarah looked at her daughters, their breathing soft and even, their faces peaceful. She thought of all the nights she'd held them close and whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Then she looked at Walter, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. "Soon," she said. "When they're ready. When we're ready." And for the first time since their paths had crossed again, she truly believed they would be. The wind on the rooftop was gentle, the kind that carried spring in it, the soft kind of breeze that hinted winter had finally given up its hold. Below, the city stretched out in every direction, glittering in the late afternoon sun, alive with movement, noise, and color. But up here, it was quiet. Still. Like time had paused for something sacred. The rooftop garden wasn't large, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. Strings of lights hung overhead, gently swaying, and clusters of white chairs had been arranged in a semicircle, facing a narrow aisle lined with potted wildflowers. There were no photographers pushing through crowds, no grand orchestra playing. Just a few dozen people, friends, new co-workers, and a few people Sarah had met during her long journey, who now stood beaming with quiet joy. Lily and Sky wore matching pale yellow dresses and carried small baskets of petals, which they had taken very seriously all morning. They'd rehearsed their walk at least 10 times in the living room the night before, each one trying to outdo the other in grace and precision, until they collapsed in giggles and Sarah had to beg them to go to bed. Now, they stood at the edge of the rooftop garden, eyes wide and proud, holding hands tightly as they waited for the music to cue them. Walter stood near the front, a bundle of nerves hidden beneath a calm smile. He wore a simple navy suit, no tie, just the same quiet confidence he'd grown into over the past months. He had never been a man drawn to attention, but today, he stood there like someone who had found exactly where he was supposed to be. His eyes were locked on the door where Sarah would enter, and in them was everything he hadn't said and everything he no longer needed to explain. It hadn't happened overnight. Their love hadn't come rushing back in with fireworks or declarations. It had rebuilt itself in the slow, careful unfolding of days, packing school lunches together, talking late into the night after the girls had gone to sleep, supporting one another through real-life moments. Sarah had hesitated, unsure if she could let herself trust again, but Walter had never pressured her. He waited. He listened. And he stayed. The decision to tell the girls had come quietly one evening over dinner. Walter had sat them down and explained, his voice trembling slightly, as he told them that he was more than Mr. W. He was their father. For a long moment, neither girl had spoken. Sarah held her breath. Then Lily had asked if that meant he was going to live with them forever, and when he nodded, she simply said, "Good," and returned to her mashed potatoes. Sky took longer to open up, but in the weeks after, she had slowly started calling him Dad, at first only when she thought no one was listening, then out loud, clear and proud. Now, as the music played, the girls made their way down the aisle, petals floating behind them like soft confetti. They took their places, giggling softly to each other, and turned to look toward the entrance. Then Sarah appeared. She wasn't in a designer gown. There was no dramatic veil or runway makeup. Her dress was simple, cream-colored silk with lace at the sleeves. Her hair was down, loose and curled gently at the ends, with just one small clip holding it back from her face. But to Walter, she looked like she had stepped out of a dream he hadn't realized he'd been having for years. She wasn't just beautiful, she was whole, steady, radiant. Every hardship she'd endured, every scar life had left, had only made her shine more deeply. She walked slowly, not out of nervousness, but as if she was absorbing every second. Each step toward him felt like a step away from the darkness of the past, from the nights of hunger and fear, from the silence of unanswered questions. And when she finally reached him, when their hands met and she looked into his eyes, it was as though none of the years apart could touch the truth of this moment. The ceremony was short and honest. There were no extravagant vows or borrowed poetry. They each spoke in their own words, to each other, and to the girls. Walter promised not only to love Sarah, but to protect and honor the family they had become. Sarah spoke of forgiveness, of growth, and of the kind of love that survives silence and distance. She promised not perfection, but presence. The girls, when asked if they accepted Walter as their forever dad, responded with enthusiastic, synchronized nods that made the small crowd laugh softly through tears. When it was done, when they were pronounced husband and wife, there was no wild cheering, no loud music. Just quiet clapping, the gentle hum of the wind, and two little girls running into their parents' arms. They stayed on the rooftop as the sun set, its golden light washing over them like a blessing. There was food, laughter, and stories shared under the string lights. For the first time in years, Sarah felt what she hadn't dared to hope for, peace. Not the fragile kind that could be stolen in a moment, but the kind you build slowly, day by day, with someone who chooses to stay even when things are hard. As night settled over the city, and the girls curled up beside them, sleep pulling them under, Walter leaned close and whispered, "We made it." Sarah rested her head against his shoulder, fingers laced with his, and whispered back, "We're just getting started." And somewhere deep inside, in the space where all the hurt had once lived, something new had taken root. Something bright. Something lasting. Something called home. This story isn't just about a millionaire finding his long-lost children or a woman surviving impossible odds. It's about the quiet strength it takes to keep going when no one is watching, and the courage it takes to open your heart again after life has tried to harden it. Walter and Sarah didn't get a fairy tale, they got something better, a love rebuilt through choice, not chance. A family formed not in perfection, but in persistence. And perhaps that's the most powerful kind of ending, not one where everything is magically fixed, but where two people, scarred and real, choose to start again, together. In a world that often moves too fast to notice what truly matters, their story is a reminder that sometimes, the most life-changing moments come when we simply stop, look, and decide to care.